Last year, my fiance and my mom passed away, one right after the other. After they died, I fell into a deep depression. Though I thought I was pulling off the whole "I'm fine" thing, my friends could clearly see through it. A close friend almost insisted I move in with her and leave the apartment I had shared with my fiance for 10 years. She wanted me to start fresh, and while I didn't think I was ready to move on, the idea of not living alone was appealing. Plus, her apartment is in a much nicer neighborhood than the one I was living in, so I agreed. Living with her has been fantastic. Our schedules are opposite. I'm on days, she's on nights, so we both get alone time, but also have at least one day off together each week to hang out. Moving has also allowed me to walk to work since it's so close. I thought that would be a godsend, but that 10-minute walk turned into a 2-month-long nightmare. One evening after work, I decided to sit in the park between my apartment and my job. As I was sitting there, a man approached me. I noticed his face first. He was almost handsome, if not a little rough-looking. Even though I live in an urban area with a high homeless population, it didn't occur to me that this man was anything but a mildly handsome guy in his 40s. So, I smiled and looked back down at my phone, expecting him to walk on by. Nope. He asked me what time it was, and when I looked up to tell him, I noticed all the stuff he was carrying. It was so random. A kid's chalkboard with nonsense all over it, a paper bag full of old magazines and paperwork, and a steel shelf that once held CDs. I then noticed he wasn't wearing shoes, and his hands were filthy. It finally dawned on me that this was not going to be a normal encounter. He started talking non-stop. Some of it was nonsense, but some of it was coherent, and all of it was crazy. From what I could follow, he told me he had just been released from prison and was looking for a tattoo shop because he wanted to get "fuck the doc," the Department of Corrections, and 34 inches, the number of DOC violations he had while in prison, tattooed on him, and he wanted the DOC to pay for it. He then noticed a button on my bag with the logo of a local gay bar. He told me he had gone there one night and went home with a guy. Then he looked me up and down and said, "But young ladies are my problem." I gathered my stuff and left immediately. I love this apartment, but it has its drawbacks, which became glaringly obvious after this encounter. The apartment is on the first floor. I love it because you can walk out the sliding glass doors, one in the living room and one in my bedroom, right onto an awesome gated patio with tables and grills for barbecuing. It's great in the summer. I now hate it because it's right on the street, and the fencing is clearly very easy to scale. One very early morning, around 5 a.m., I heard a man scream, "What the fuck are you doing?" So loud and so close that it woke me up from a dead sleep. I legitimately thought it was coming from inside my bedroom. It turned out to be coming from outside. A neighbor had been leaving for work and discovered the man from the park sleeping against my sliding glass door. The dude got scared off. My neighbor checked on me, and once I calmed down, I chalked it up to a messed up coincidence. 2 weeks later, I was sleeping, and at some point, this man came onto the patio and started tapping on my sliding glass door. I honestly just lay there, frozen in fear, until he escalated to full-blown kicking the glass. I turned the light on to grab my phone, and he took off. I called the police, and they came over to take the report and review the footage from the building's cameras. The footage confirmed it was the man from the park, and more disturbingly, the hallway cameras showed that on more than one occasion, he had slipped into the building behind a resident and sat in the lobby for several hours, at one point trying my doorknob and my neighbor's doorknob to see if they were locked. He even went so far as to hide in the little mailbox room when he saw my roommate coming in from work. The police think he either followed me from the park or had just happened to notice me at one point when I was on the patio. It's been a few weeks, and I haven't seen him, and no one has reported seeing him in or around the building. In the summer of 2015, I worked at a university in a small southern town. I lived a few miles away from campus in a 2-bedroom house with a roommate, and my schedule was pretty rigid. Same routine every day. I went to class in the morning, worked in the afternoon, and got home around 9 p.m. One Thursday night, I arrived home at the usual time and noticed an old pickup truck idling at the yield sign across the street from my house. I didn't know the make or model, but it was beat up, peeling paint, rust, dents. It looked really out of place in our neighborhood. Most people there drove nice modern cars, so this thing stood out like a sore thumb. The streets were deserted. It clearly wasn't waiting for other cars to pass. I thought maybe the driver was just texting or something, but since my roommate wasn't home yet, I didn't want to leave the safety of my own vehicle. I'm a petite woman who doesn't carry pepper spray anymore, so I try to be aware of my surroundings. I pulled into my driveway and just sat there, staring at the truck and waiting for it to leave. Eventually it did. It pulled away slowly and made its way out of the neighborhood toward the main road. When it was out of sight, I went inside, locked the door behind me, and made myself some dinner. By 11 p.m., my roommate still hadn't come home, and I was folding laundry and listening to podcasts in my bedroom. I'd forgotten all about the truck. Suddenly, the lights went out. That spooked me because normally our power didn't shut off unless there was bad weather. That night was clear as a bell, so I immediately called my roommate and asked where he was. He told me he was already on his way home and would be there in about 5 minutes. Relieved, I just told him to step on it and hung up. No reason to freak out about a power outage, right? He'd be there soon enough, and then we could figure it out together. I walked into the living room to wait for him. Our front door had a little diamond-shaped window in it, which I always hated. I stood on my tiptoes and looked out to see if our neighbor's power was out as well. I was surprised to see that it wasn't. Even the streetlight near our front yard was still on. Weird. Had I somehow blown a fuse? Just as I considered making a trip to the basement to reset the breakers, I received a text message from my mom. I don't remember what it was about, but it only took me a few seconds to answer it. After I did, I looked out the window again. To my utter shock and surprise, there was a man standing under the streetlight. He hadn't been there before, and I instantly got a bad feeling. He was middle-aged and about 6 feet tall, with a pot belly and little round glasses, unkempt hair, old sneakers. His white t-shirt and blue jeans were filthy. He looked like he'd been working on a car or something. Mechanic dirty, you know? And he had this awful, smug expression on his face. I had never seen him before. Still in shock at actually seeing someone out there, I didn't move. Luckily, he couldn't see me because the inside of my house was pitch dark. But to my absolute horror, he was headed straight for me. Not walking quickly or with purpose, just kind of casually shuffling toward the house. If someone else were to pass by, they probably wouldn't realize what he was up to. He even glanced around a few times, as if making sure nobody else was watching. Inch by inch, he made his way into the yard. This guy was coming to get me. I was sure of it. I started to shake. I think it's worth mentioning that my dog is very people-oriented and usually goes bananas when he hears someone outside. This time, he was silent. He had no idea there was a man approaching, even though I was staring at him through the window. When the man was about halfway to the porch, my roommate's car finally rounded the bend and turned onto our street. As soon as those headlights lit him up, the man turned to look and recognized the approaching vehicle. My roommate and I both saw his face. He recognized that car. In his haste to get away, he nearly stepped in front of it and got run over. My roommate swerved into the driveway, scrambled out, and charged into the house. He didn't even speak to me. He just grabbed the axe out of our utility closet and went back outside to confront the man. But the man was gone. We called the police and the power company, and they both sent someone to check things out. The police didn't find anything. The repairman reset the box on the pole near our house. Apparently the switch had flipped. which is why our house, and only our house, was without electricity. I asked the repairman if there was any way that a person could have been responsible for that, but he didn't give me a straight answer. The following day, we went on a camping trip that lasted all weekend. If the man came back, we never knew. And after that, I refused to be home alone. If my roommate wasn't around when I got off work, I killed time at a local bar until he got back. We both moved away soon after. I never saw the man or the truck again, but sometimes I wonder how long he had been watching our house, and what might have happened if my roommate hadn't been on his way home that night. This happened to a friend of mine who lived in the same neighborhood as me when we were about 8 years old. My friend, E, and her family lived just a few houses down the street from mine. We lived in a neighborhood where almost everyone knew each other. The biggest worry we ever had was that some outsider would come into the neighborhood and cause trouble. Some people left their homes unlocked because we felt that safe. There was an incredibly nice family that lived directly across the street from E's house. A mom, a dad, a 16-year-old son, and their other mentally challenged son who was 22 years old. I'll call him Tim. Tim was always home because he wasn't employed due to his disability, but his parents worked full-time, and his brother was in school. All day, every day, he would be outside waving and smiling at anyone who drove or walked by. Big smiles, showing all his teeth and sometimes giggling, just out of pure excitement and happiness at interacting with other people since he spent most of his time alone. He was not creepy. One day, E was sick and didn't go to school. Even though she was only about 8 or 9 years old, E was allowed to stay home sick by herself. Plus, her mom was going to be home around 2 p.m. since she only worked part-time, and the neighborhood was safe. E locked all the doors, except the one that led into the garage. They used this as their front door because it was easier in those cookie-cutter homes to just open the garage, pull in, get out of the car, close the garage, and walk into their house through the unlocked door that led from the inside of the garage to the inside of their home. This is obviously not the safest way to protect your home from intruders, but we literally all did it, as if a flimsy garage door could keep anyone from getting in if they wanted. The worst part is that they had an outside cat and kept the garage door cracked just enough for him to get inside for his food or shelter if he needed to. So, he's asleep, feeling sick and with a fever. All the doors and windows are locked, except the door leading to the cracked garage door. Tim was bound to know she was home alone since he was outside the front of his house all the time. E wakes up to pounding on the front door. Startled, she walks downstairs and looks through the peephole. It's Tim. She cracks the door open, and he says something along the lines of how he notices everything and would guard her home since she's home alone. She said thanks, but there was no need, and to have a good day, it was beautiful weather. He looked pissed. He got angry and said, "You think I can't do it because I'm dumb, but you watch and see, 'cause me ain't dumb." She said sorry and that she didn't mean it like that, but she had to rest now. She dozed off and woke up to a noise downstairs in the kitchen, the room the door from the garage led into. She hadn't heard the garage door open, but she was sick, so she figured she was deep in sleep and just hadn't noticed. Completely disoriented from time, she looked over at the alarm clock. It was 10:20, way too early for her mom to be home. At that moment, she heard noises again downstairs. She didn't call out. She had been sleeping in her parents' bedroom and ran into their bathroom, slamming the door, loudly. Then she remembered their bathroom door had no lock on it. The noise she made slamming the door alerted the intruder to where in the house she was, and big footsteps started coming upstairs. She moved quickly and quietly to her parents' closet, which was on the other side of the big room. She closed the doors and hid behind some clothes, all the time thinking about how someone would have gotten inside. She remembered that the garage door was cracked for the cat, slightly, but not enough for a thin person to slip underneath. Tim walks into the bedroom. Tim is tall and thin. She can see him through the slatted closet doors. She sees he's holding a knife and did everything she could not to scream. He quickly went to the master bathroom where she was just moments before. These cookie-cutter houses only had about 3 floor plan layouts, so it wasn't hard for him to find. He looked inside the bathroom and didn't see her. Then he started making loud, throaty noises, like someone would if they were frustrated and angry, while pacing the entire house. She stayed in the closet for hours, even after she heard him exit through the front door. She stayed until her mom got home. She was crying hysterically and told her mom what happened. Had she not been so upset, and had one of their kitchen knives not been left by the front door, her mom might have blamed it on being delirious from a high fever, because nobody would expect Tim to do that. The police were called, and an official report was filed. I'm not sure if he had any charges pressed against him because after she told me the story once, she refused to talk about it again. I overheard her parents a few times talking about the situation to my own parents, but never heard what the consequences were. E was so traumatized she went to therapy afterward for several years, and still wouldn't talk to anyone about it because she didn't want to remember or relive the experience. We even moved into an apartment together years and years later for college purposes. She never talked about Tim. It was like he never existed, and I never asked. I noticed she always locked the front door, which you should, of course. Always locked the door that led to the patio, even though we were on the 7th level, and always locked her bedroom door, onto which she added an additional lock. And when she locked all of these doors, and the windows, she always checked 3 times, every single time. I often wonder if there was more to the story than what E told me. We were kids, after all, and sometimes kids don't know how to explain things they don't understand. It is terrifying to think about what his intentions were and what might have happened if he had found E and something else happened. As horrifying as the experience must have been for her, it made a huge statement in the neighborhood for everyone to be more careful. I will always make sure everything is locked. One summer, my cousin and I were riding our bikes back from the local corner store, something we did often because that store had the best subs. My house was only about 5 minutes from the store, and we always took the hill so we could coast down it. On this particular Saturday, the hill was under construction, so we had to go the long way back home, which would take only an extra 5 minutes. We got our subs and hopped on our bikes to pedal back to my house. I had music playing on my speaker, and we were laughing and singing along when I spotted a pickup truck trying to come up behind us. We were splitting the road, so I told my cousin to stop and wait on the side so the truck could pass us. The truck slowly went by, and once it did, my cousin and I pedaled off towards home again. I saw the same truck go into a parking lot and turn around. I wondered what they were doing there. I live in a very ethnic neighborhood that's mainly African American and Hispanic, and the men sitting in this truck were white. They had an American flag and a Confederate flag, and that's when I became extra cautious about this particular bike ride. My cousin and I were about 11 and 12 years old, me being the older one, and we are both African American females. At this point, I started to panic. I told my cousin to be wary of the truck and let's go. As we pedaled off, the truck started its engine and pulled out onto the road. By this time, I believe they realized we were onto them, so they began driving faster. My bike was built for speed, but my cousin was on my mom's bike, and it wasn't the easiest thing to pedal. I told her that instead of trying to outrun them, we should outsmart them. We started to weave in and out of side streets, and so did the truck. By this time, they had started yelling out of the truck. "Hey you, stop, we just want to talk." I wasn't believing they wanted to have any conversation I was interested in. The driver stuck his head out and yelled, "Hey N-words, don't you hear this white man yelling? Stop, you need to listen." That's when I knew we had to get the hell out of there, and fast. I glanced back every so often, and on my final glance, I noticed the passenger had a gun in his hands. We live in the countryside, so I knew that was most likely a gun used for hunting. At this point, we were being hunted. I was nowhere near my house because we had pedaled all over my neighborhood, not wanting them to know where I lived. We had pedaled for our lives, and the truck was gaining on us, running stop signs and everything. Somehow, we managed to gain some space between us and the truck. My cousin and I darted behind a church and hid. We saw the truck slowly go by us, and they didn't notice us. They stopped their truck, and I was terrified they were going to get out, but thankfully, they never did. However, I did hear them say, "Damn, they are harder to catch than wild animals," to which the other guy responded, "They are wild animals." They laughed and made more comments about how if they caught us, they would make sure we knew they were superior. I was disgusted by their comments, and I wanted to say something, but I knew better. We waited another 15 minutes or so to make sure the truck was truly gone and not just waiting for us somewhere. My cousin looked like she was going to have an asthma attack at any second, so I knew I had to get her home. We finally managed to pedal home safely. A quick 5-minute ride home turned into a 35-minute ordeal. I was in the hospital for about 10 days, suffering from a kidney infection. My mother visited me, but the rest of the family was too busy, so I was pretty lonely and in pain. I used to keep in touch with my friends and family by mobile phone. Hospitals over the last 10 years allow the use of mobile phones. There was a young male student doctor who was chatty and friendly to all the patients. I can't remember his name, so I'm going to call him Edward. While attending the ward, Edward used to chat with me. He was very intelligent and a nice and decent chap. He gave me a get-well-soon card to cheer me up. The other female patients teased Edward and said that he should ask me out. I made it very clear to Edward that I did not fancy him at all. I told him he was like a brother to me. Edward laughed at what the ladies had said. He assured me that he didn't fancy me either, and said that a patient-doctor relationship was unethical anyway. After 10 days, I felt better. The doctors discharged me. I said my goodbyes to the other patients and to Edward and wished him well in his studies and career. I called a taxi to take me home. I had put my mobile phone on silent. When I reached home, I checked my phone and saw that I had 8 missed calls from a number I didn't recognize. I was puzzled, but didn't think too much of it. I thought I'd ring the number the next day. I had a shower and went to bed. The next morning, I checked my phone. I realized I'd forgotten to turn the ringer back on and saw that I had another 10 missed calls. I called the number and a man answered the phone. To my surprise, it was Edward. I was a bit annoyed and asked Edward how he got my number. He told me that I had given it to him. I told him that I hadn't. He insisted so much that I had. I even began to doubt myself. In the hospital, I was in a lot of pain and doped up with morphine most of the time. Anyway, Edward and I chatted on the phone. He called me a few days later while I was recuperating at home. Edward would call me every few days. One day, I told Edward that I couldn't talk as I was still not well, but needed to go food shopping before the shops closed. Edward offered to shop for me and bring the food to my place. I politely declined. After that, Edward started calling me every day. I often didn't take his calls. He texted me, saying that he needed to talk as his mother was ill. I answered his next call. He told me that he had just said that because he wanted to talk to me. He said that he knew I had a hospital appointment in a few days, and that he would meet me there. He told me that he had a new mobile phone for me and would put me on his family plan. I asked him how he knew that I had an appointment. He told me that he'd accessed my medical records. I did not attend the hospital appointment as I didn't want to see Edward. I told Edward that I didn't want any more contact with him and to leave me alone. Edward told me that he loved me and wanted to marry me. Edward kept on calling and calling me. I did not take his calls. In one day, I'd have 40 missed calls and 60 text messages from him. He even called me in the middle of the night. I was creeped out and beginning to get scared. One day, I had a call from an unknown number. It was Edward. Edward kept changing his number so that I'd pick up. I was really scared by now. I told the police, but they said there was nothing they could do as he was not threatening me, etc. And Edward kept changing his number using pay-as-you-go phone chips, so it was hard to prove that it was actually him phoning me. I felt that Edward could get nasty and dangerous. I was particularly scared as my mom pointed out to me that he could find out where I lived by checking my medical records. I asked a good male friend of mine to answer Edward's phone call and pretend he was my new boyfriend. Well, that didn't work. Edward didn't believe that I had a boyfriend. I was at my wit's end. I wasn't sleeping or eating, and I was terrified. I even had friends over to stay with me. I made sure that I was never alone. One morning I woke up, and instead of fear, I was angry. How dare that stupid little coward bully me and totally take over and ruin my life? I telephoned Edward. I was very firm and assertive. I told him that if he ever contacted me again, I would report him to the dean of his university. I would send the dean all the text messages that he'd written to me. I told him that his career as a doctor would be over. From that day, Edward never contacted me again. I just wish I'd thought of it sooner, but I was so relieved as I could lead a normal life again. So back in November 2020, I was in and out of the hospital with testicular torsion 8 times altogether. On my last visit to one of the hospitals, I called a taxi to go home, but it would take about 30 minutes to get to me because it was a Saturday in the city. Since there was going to be a bit of a wait, I decided to sit down in a garden area just in front of the hospital. It was 3 a.m., about 0 degrees Celsius, and I had been awake for 36 hours at that point. My taxi was on its way, and I just sat cross-legged on the bench, headphones on, and nicotine keeping me alive. Everything was fine until, after 10 minutes, I noticed a guy very clearly walking directly towards me. He was stumbling a little bit, so I just assumed he was drunk. As he got level with me, he stopped right in front of me and said something that I didn't hear. I looked up and said, "What?" "Sorry, I had music on," as I pulled off my headphones, and he looked me dead in the eye and just said, "I could fucking batter you right now." Of everything I was expecting him to say, that wasn't on the list. Caught off guard, I tried to disarm him with humor by saying, "I don't doubt it," which did work, thank God, because he would have absolutely pummeled me into the ground. Every time I said that or something similar, he'd just say, "I could batter you. I want to deck you right here, right now, and I could take you in a fight," just to recall a few of them. After his anger had toned down, he sat on the bench next to me and started generally drunk rambling about his family and friends, and very specifically, his best friend's girlfriend that he was having an affair with. Then he pointed out my shoes, saying, "Those are nice, mate. Can I have them?" Obviously, I said no firmly, but not aggressively, then thanked him and told him about the fact that I got them on sale. He said, "Can I touch them?" which was immediately a big red flag. I politely declined, but he started rubbing my shoe anyway. I was still sitting cross-legged on the bench. Then, in one swift movement, he grabbed my ankle, pulled my entire leg up to his face, and put the entire toe of my size 11 Converses in his mouth. At that point, while sitting in stunned silence, I started desperately looking around and saw the hospital police walking over. The officer asked if we were there together. The guy said yes, I said no. The officer then asked if he was a patient. I said yes, he said no. I told the officer I was just waiting for my taxi, and the guy rambled something I couldn't really make out to the officer, who suggested he move along. The guy stood up, gave me a handshake, and walked off into the night. The officer obviously asked if I was okay, and I told him what happened. He was just as confused as I was. After that, My taxi was due in 5 minutes, so I went and stood on the opposite side of the hospital where the taxi rank was. I asked some friends, who are familiar with a lot of drugs, what he could have been on, and they unanimously said meth. They also said the shoe thing was probably just a fetish. I'm a female in my mid-20s, and I work at my local hospital. This happened last week after I finished my shift in the evening. It was still light outside, so I decided to walk the 20 minutes home. Whenever I'm walking, I tend to listen to music on my iPod and just zone out. Not the safest idea, I know, but most of us do it. A few minutes into my walk, I had to cross a bridge over the motorway. As you walk up the slope to the bridge, there's a small wooded area on either side. I could feel something or someone around me, so I casually stopped my music and looked around. Nothing seemed out of place, and I thought maybe I was being overly sensitive. I kept the music off, just in case, and continued walking. A few seconds later, I heard rustling behind me and turned around, startled. Again, nothing was there. At this point, my heart was racing, but I tried to convince myself I was being paranoid. I reached the top of the bridge, where I was out in the open and could see all around me, so I felt a lot better. 10 minutes later, as I neared home, I was laughing at myself for being so silly and paranoid. I was as relaxed as I could be, with my music back on, just enjoying winding down from work. I had just reached the top of the park opposite my road and was feeling perked up since I was nearly home. I looked behind me, not because I heard or sensed anything, but I'm very thankful I did, and saw a guy about 3 feet behind me. He was that close. The guy was tall, skinny, and had greasy black hair hanging around his face. He was dressed all in black. The creepiest part was that he looked dead behind the eyes. He was staring directly at me, and there was nothing there, just blankness. I turned back around and started walking quickly down the park, hoping I was just being silly. I contemplated rummaging in my bag for my phone to call the police, but didn't want to slow myself down. At that point, I still wondered if I was misreading the situation. The creeper continued following me, and although he wasn't as close as 3 feet anymore, he had still significantly kept up his speed. Every time I looked behind me, he was staring directly at me, still emotionless and completely dead behind the eyes. I contemplated heading somewhere else to try and lose him, but I was terrified and just wanted to get to the safety of my house. As my house came into view, I decided to run for it, which I should have done sooner, evidently. When I looked behind me, I noticed the creeper wasn't running after me, but was still walking fast, staring at me. I got to my door and rummaged through my bag for my keys, fully aware that at any moment the creeper could catch up. I grabbed them, hurriedly let myself into the house when he was 15 feet away, and slammed and locked the door behind me. I then ran upstairs. The front door has glass panels, and our living room area has big glass doors facing the back garden. I didn't want him to be able to see me. I was shaking as I edged up the stairs and looked out of the stairway window. He was nowhere to be seen. I went upstairs and looked out of the bedroom window to get a better view of the front garden, and I couldn't see him. I thought he'd gone. With my heart still racing, I got my phone out of my bag and headed downstairs to call the non-emergency number. As I walked into my living room, his face was pressed up against the glass, peering into my house, and we made eye contact. Dead eyes again. I let out quite the scream and ran back upstairs. I called the emergency number. As I waited for the police, the creeper took a seat in my garden, cross-legged, just staring at the house. The police arrived within 10 minutes and picked him up. He went without any struggle. The policewoman who came told me he had said to them, "I was just waiting for her." It turns out the creeper is an inpatient in the psychiatric ward of my hospital. From what I've found out since, he developed a bit of a fascination with me from seeing me around the hospital while I was doing my job. Some people I know in the psychiatry unit told me he'd been mentioning his girlfriend recently, and they all thought it was another patient. They now think he was talking about me. He's been moved to another hospital now, somewhere where he can recover, and I won't be afraid to go to work. I'm hoping he doesn't have the freedom to just leave as he pleases if he plans on creeping on hospital staff. I do hope he gets better, but I'm finding it hard to have warm wishes for him when he terrified me as much as he did. I will definitely be catching the bus from now on. A while ago, I got a job at a small hospital just outside of town. I was excited because it was the first job I'd been offered since completing my schooling. It was just casual work, but I was ecstatic at the opportunity to work there. The pay was great, and it was the place where I completed my practicum. Most of the time, I worked 12-hour shifts, 7 a.m. to 7 p.m., but occasionally, I'd be given the 3 p.m. to 11 p.m. shifts. I didn't care much for those. I was used to working late from my previous job, but now I had to drive a lot further to get home, and the late shifts were usually very slow. Another reason I didn't like them was because there weren't many people on staff, and I would get lonely. Usually there were 4 nurses, 1 admin, me, and the emergency doctor. That was it. Being in a small hospital like this one, you see some pretty strange things come in. Some people can't make it into the city, so we've had the emergency STARS helicopter drop in now and then. I've seen terrible things, like whole families dying from accidents on the curved country roads. I've even had people bring in animals in desperation because there was no vet nearby that was open. One particular night, around 10 p.m., I was sitting and talking with one of the RNs about a patient's chart, but mostly just wasting time until I could go home at 11 p.m. The hospital was quiet, and I'd only checked around 6 people into the emergency room at that point. I remember I was eating my yogurt when I heard a strange noise coming from the main doors. I saw a man walking toward us. He looked mostly normal, but he had a long coat on, which was strange as it was the middle of summer. Even though it was dark outside, it was still relatively warm. The RN next to me sighed and got up to go to the bathroom, leaving me to tend to our new arrival. As the man drew closer, the strange sound got louder, and something caught the light. He was dragging something behind him that I couldn't quite make out, but I assumed it was metal by the noise it was making. It sent a shiver up my spine. He stopped at the desk, and I could see that his eyes were wide, his pupils dilated. His face was pale, and he looked like he hadn't slept in a while. I'd seen this look many times and immediately associated it with someone who was high on something. He leaned on the desk, ran his fingers through his hair, pulling at it and grinding his teeth. When people like this come in, they're usually looking for drugs. Most of the time they'll complain of a migraine or fibromyalgia, anything we can't easily disprove. I processed him as usual and noticed he was getting more and more irritable as time passed. When I finished and pointed him toward the waiting area, he asked how long it would be. Knowing that the on-call doctor had gone on a quick break, I estimated about half an hour. That's when his entire demeanor changed. Anger was obvious on his face as he stormed over to the waiting area, which is a room between the emergency room and the front desk area with doors. As he walked away, I caught a glimpse of what he was dragging, and I quickly realized it was an axe. I panicked and almost called the code over the paging system, but I didn't want him to realize what I was doing. I promptly called the police on my cell phone and ran down the hall to signal to the nurses that we had a serious issue. The police would have to come from 2 towns over, which takes, on average, 20 minutes. Of course, since we were all small women, we didn't want to go near him. He was tall and muscular. Even if we combined our efforts, we probably wouldn't stand a chance. I calmly walked back to the front desk and paged the doctor, asking him to call me. I waited and waited but never got a response. I watched the man getting more agitated. Soon, he started yelling and asking for help. I hid from him, not wanting him to come back to me. We devised a plan to lock him in the waiting area. The glass was reinforced and the doors were heavy, so it should hold him in there until the police arrived. The plan went off without a hitch until the man realized what we'd done. He started screaming and throwing chairs around the room. Fortunately, he was alone, so we didn't have to worry about him hurting anyone. Then he started using his axe on the door and the glass to the front desk area where we were all standing and watching. I've never been so terrified in my life. What made it even worse was the fact that he was making some progress on the door. At that moment, the emergency doctor walked in through the front door of the hospital, sipping a drink from the convenience store across the road. He saw us all huddled behind the desk and quickly took charge of the situation. After getting all the necessary information, he disappeared toward the back entrance of the emergency room, the way ambulances bring patients in. He unlocked the door of the waiting room and tackled the man to the floor when he wasn't looking, then proceeded to tie him up with cable ties. He sat on his back until the cops arrived. I was so thankful to have that young, physically fit doctor with us on that night. I bought him coffee every time our schedules crossed as a thank you, but I don't think it will ever be enough. As this was the second incident that happened to me while working a late shift, I decided never to work late shifts again. I'm now a Monday to Friday 9 to 5 worker. It's much safer that way. This happened to me when I was roughly 4 years old. Not super creepy, but it certainly contributed to my poor mother's fear of men, and consequently the one she instilled in me. When I was a kid, there was company in my neighborhood that would drive around door to door and sell frozen meals and meat for relatively inexpensive prices. Given the fact that my neighborhood was preoccupied by parents with young children and the elderly, this service was quite popular, and my busy mom was just as much of a fan as the rest of the cul-de-sac. A few alternating people generally circled around weekly, and I remember them decently well, since my twin sister and I were very friendly and rushed to the door anytime there was a visitor. There was a very straightforward but kind woman who just wanted to get her job done. A sweet young man who adored our terrier, and a man roughly in his 40s who was generally very outgoing and talkative. This story is centered on the last person. I don't recall this guy's name, nor does it matter for the sake of this story, so I'll just call him CDG, or Creepy Delivery Guy. Like I previously stated, CDG was a friendly guy and outwardly quite normal. A clean-shaven, articulate guy who loved to talk about his daughter for minutes on end, who was about my age. He talked to my sister and I plenty while at the door. Even so, my mom still got a weird feeling from him, but dismissed them solely because he hadn't done anything to warrant concern. After a few rounds in our neighborhood, he asked my mother if he could use the restroom in a polite manner because his shift had been quite long. She hesitantly agreed and he thanked her, then returned after an abnormally long time and gave us our order. After this, the shifts no longer alternated, and it was just CDG who delivered in our neighborhood. He requested to use the restroom every single time he delivered, and eventually didn't even bother explaining. Allow me to restate that he took an unusually long time in the bathroom. For my mom, the feelings of discomfort were intensifying, but she was much too polite. The turning point, however, was when, while in our kitchen, CDG described to our mother how his daughter had gotten an infection in her vagina because she hadn't wiped properly after pooping and had wiped back to front. He turned towards us and smiled wide, though still talking to my mom, and requested that he could show my sister and I how to wipe properly so it didn't happen to us. My mom said no. What a shock. After that, she didn't answer the door when he came around, and whenever we saw him driving the truck in the neighborhood, CDG would glare at us. We later discovered through word of mouth that he was unmarried and didn't have any children. I used to, and still occasionally do, work as a food delivery driver for my dad's Thai food restaurant. If I can remember correctly, the night I'm about to describe happened no more than a year ago, but I can't be sure of the date or even the season it was in. The restaurant I delivered for is very popular, but only to a smaller crowd, in the surrounding average-sized 2 or 3 towns. It was Thursday, and the number of deliveries on a Thursday night was always very small. I had a delivery to a house about 5 miles away, on this deeply wooded back road which I had delivered to before. The road was so dark at night that when you turned your headlights off driving down it, you were blind. There was not a street light for at least a couple of miles, and the house I needed to bring this food to had to be the most secluded house in the whole town. Not secluded as in no neighbors or buildings around it secluded, but secluded as in no one can be living there secluded. When I started driving there, the sun was about to start setting. The food was in the back, everything was normal, and I was listening to music. The 5-mile drive was quick, but when I got there, I noticed the receipt on the bag of food I was supposed to deliver read the number of a house that didn't exist on that road. The number was pretty similar to the house I had in mind, the secluded, abandoned-looking house that I had delivered to before. I assumed that the phone girl must have written the wrong number at the front desk because she did that a lot, and I know this was the house that called. As I pulled into the driveway, I noticed the sun was at the point of setting, probably 10 or so minutes until it got terrifyingly dark to be in the middle of the woods. There was still some light left, and I had the headlights on bright, so it wasn't as creepy. I took the bag of food and went to the front door. Knocked a few times and waited about a minute. Knocked again and waited about 20 seconds. I decided to go to the back porch, since that's where everybody was when I delivered last time. Knocked loud. No answer. Figured maybe I do have the wrong house after all. So I went back to the car with the food and decided to call the phone number on the receipt. Dialed it up and let it ring. No answer. Then I decided to call my dad to ask him if I was at the wrong house, or if I was given the wrong phone number, because these people were obviously not home. I was the only car in the driveway. As I'm looking for my dad's contact number in my phone, a blocked caller comes across my screen. I answered my phone, not even feeling the slightest bit creeped out. Yet. I put the phone up to my ear. Hello? Hello, you just called me. Mike? Kid you not, in the deepest, weirdest, most authentic sounding voice I've ever heard. It was clearly a man on the other line with a distinctive accent like nothing anyone could just make up that I know. It was foreign. And there wasn't anyone I called recently. I'd been working for the past 2.5 hours. My name wouldn't be able to show up on someone's caller ID anyway, because I was on my mom's phone plan. Yes, did you order Thai food? I'm here now. No, I didn't. And they hung up. What the hell? Why doesn't this man want his food? What is going on? How could he know my name? Blocked number? Why? So I call my dad, sitting in the driveway, sun just about to set. He told me he would call them and call me back. I waited. He called me back really quick and told me that they would be right out to get their food. I was at the right house. I asked my dad, and I had even called the right number. The most normal-looking man walked outside the front door, and I gave him his food, only for him to pay and thank me in the most polite, normal-sounding, friendly accent and tone imaginable. This was not the guy on the phone. I got back in the car and put it into reverse. I drove back to the restaurant, the sky now pitch black. Every time I get a blocked call now, I won't pick up. This all took place quite a few years ago, when I was about 14 or 15. As a result, my role in this story is very passive, so forgive me for not doing something about this when I really should have. My family used to order food from Schwan. If you're not familiar, they're one of those companies with food catalogs that you can order from, and a delivery man with a freezer truck will deliver it to your door. We had the same delivery guy every time, so he and my mom struck up a bit of a repartee. They'd chat whenever he delivered the orders, sometimes for more than 5 minutes. I was usually on the couch, which is in the same room as the front door, when the deliveries came, so I heard the conversations. I didn't really pay much attention, but the guy struck me as a little strange. Not downright scary, but sort of off. I figured he was just socially awkward, or maybe had some very mild mental disorder. But something just made me not like him, so I avoided him as much as I could. One thing that struck me is when I'd walk past the hallway that led to the door, he'd always look past my mom and sort of watch me. It always seemed like more than a quick, reactionary glance to movement, but more of a steady look. As a result, I'd try to stay in place when he made his deliveries, because I didn't like him staring at me when I was in my pajamas. I also didn't like him looking inside my house like that, seeing which directions the hallway branched out into. I've always been a little paranoid, so I was mindful of that sort of thing. Time went on, and our financial situation got rough. We had to tighten our purse strings a little, so the delivery food had to go. Our last delivery came, and when the delivery man asked my mom if she'd like to place a new order, she declined. Of course, he tried to convince her to continue ordering, but any employee of any company will do that. So we thought nothing of it. Then the next week rolled around and he was back in the neighborhood doing his deliveries. He knocked on our door. Now here's where my memory gets fuzzy. Either my mom answered and told him no again, and he came back again the next week, at which point we didn't answer the door, or my mom didn't answer at all. I forget a bit how many times he knocked on our door on delivery day, probably in the 1 to 3 range. Nothing too large, but a bit pushy and excessive. One of those days, though, something strange happened. My mom and I heard the knock at the door and peeked out a window to confirm it was him. We were very quiet and weren't moving, so he wouldn't hear us inside. Because by this time, he was really stepping over a line and creeping us out. So here we are, standing down the hallway from the door, waiting for him to leave, when we hear the doorknob turn. Now thankfully, we had the door locked. But this guy just tried to enter our home uninvited, when either he thought we weren't home or knew we were home. My mom and I stared at each other in complete shock. The guy left briefly after that, and we were sure to watch him drive away, and made sure both our doors were locked for the rest of the day, just in case he came back. Thankfully, he didn't, and when the next week's delivery day rolled around, he left us alone. It doesn't end there, though. My mom then got a call that one of her credit cards had been frozen due to some suspicious charges. At this point, the recession hadn't fully hit yet, so we had multiple credit cards. The one that was frozen was one my mom didn't use for anything, except for Schwan. In hindsight, she noticed that once or twice, the delivery guy hadn't just swiped her credit card in his little machine in front of her. He had taken it to his truck, where she couldn't see him, and swiped it then. Why that didn't raise a red flag for her, I don't know. But clearly this creep had written down her credit card information. So since the only place she had used this card was with Schwan, she called the company and told them what was up. I think she might have also told them about how the guy tried to come in our house. They said they'd look into it. Soon we noticed that the Schwan truck was being driven by someone different, leading us to believe the creep had been fired. We breathed a little easier knowing he wasn't trolling our neighborhood on a weekly basis. At the time, I had a friend who worked at the local supermarket a few blocks from my house. One day she started telling me about this creepy new bread delivery guy at the store. Apparently, this guy was talking to the teenage, severely underage cashier girls inappropriately. My friend felt creeped out by him the moment he first spoke to her, so she was pretty cold and curt to him, so he left her alone. Instead, he started talking to one of her friends and co-workers, who was, mind you, no older than 16. He would talk to her for long times in uncomfortably familiar ways. Eventually, he started telling this teenage girl long stories about how he was cheating on his wife with a woman with a prosthetic leg, and how hot he thought her prosthetic was. The poor girl had no idea how to say fuck off, so she acted friendly to him, even though she would later tell my friend how much she hated him and how creepy he was. As I'm sure you can imagine, this whole story reminded me of my own story about a delivery creep, so I shared my own story, and we noticed the time he had been fired from Schwan seemed to run pretty close to when this new bread guy showed up. So I asked my friend to describe the guy, and you guessed it, it was none other than creepy Schwan guy. Soon enough, he was no longer the bread delivery guy for the grocery store, and I haven't heard anything about him since. But it really makes me shudder to think about how he preyed on my mom, who was only trying to be nice and friendly to him, not to mention what might have happened if we hadn't locked our door that day.